Thanks a lot, Anandi Mani, for giving us the opportunity to interview today. First, I would like to ask you, how does your research help us to understand which policies are effective at reducing poverty?
I think what my work shows is that when we think about poverty, traditionally we are used to thinking about people who lack material resources, whether it's money or whether it's other assets, etc. But I think what the research I've been doing shows is that we need to think about it not just in terms of material resources, but also that constantly having to manage with less resources depletes your mental resources. So really poverty is a double whammy. It's not just material but also mental resources. So I think when we look at it in this way, then we understand a lot of behaviors of the poor, which we might otherwise think that, look, this is not about a lack of money. Why can't they get it right? Why can't they monitor how much TV their kids watch, or be better parents, like talk more to their kids, or look after their health, do simple things like wash their hands or do vaccinations, and so on and so forth. So I think that once we have that understanding, then it changes a little bit how we think about designing policies. So for example, typically when we design anti-poverty programs, a lot of governments are worried about creating some hoops for people to jump through so that only people who are truly eligible will take up these programs. But sometimes in doing this, you can make it so challenging for people to access these programs that it defeats the purpose. So to take a simple example, there is evidence which shows that if you help poor people fill in the forms for their kids to apply for college, for financial aid, there's like more than a 20% increase in the number of kids who actually end up going to college, right? So it takes bandwidth, mentally it takes bandwidth to figure out a complicated form and fill it in. So every policy that we design, we have to think not just about proving eligibility, but also making it accessible in terms of making things simple, making things, sending simple text reminders, all those things, also as integrating it into the design of the policy.
Okay, so that's very interesting, I think, and the point is very clear. So then another question for you is there a gender bias in poverty among marginalized?
Gender bias. So, last year there was this report, I think, which Oxfam had put out, and that number started getting circulated, saying that 70% of the world's poor are women. I don't think that that number, so there's a recent World Bank blog about this question, which is sort of looking at the question more carefully, and they're doing it with cross-country data. So I think it depends really on the age and the stage of the life cycle, whether there's a gender gap or not. So when you look at very young children, I think there is a gender gap. More girls are in poorer households. So I think it's something like 105 girls for every 100 boys are in poorer households. So there is a gender gap there. More girls are poor. And then if you look somewhere around the working age, like 25 to 34, the gap in fact widens more. There are, for every 100 boys who are for every 100 men who are poor, 122 women are poor. So at that age as well, there is a gender gap. By the time people get to middle age, that gap narrows. And then as people get very old, 65 and older, again, there is a bit of a gender gap. So it depends on which stage of the life cycle you're talking about. And all these numbers, generally, if the level of poverty in a country is low, typically the gender gap also tends to be smaller. But the poorer the country, the bigger the gender gap. These numbers that I'm citing to you is like a worldwide average. Okay. Yeah. So it depends on the stage of the life cycle.
Okay. So then last question, I think that there has been a trend towards policies aimed at reducing poverty that try to empower women in poor environments. Yes. So is there any evidence that these policies what's the evidence about the effectiveness of these policies?
Yeah. So when I think of welfare of women, I would like to think about it not just in terms of the money they have, but sort of on a, when I think of empowerment, I would want to think about it in a broader sense. Yeah. I think that even if everything is not about money, some of it is empowering them on dimensions which are related to reducing violence or things like that. So let me speak of three different categories of things. Some in which the evidence doesn't show any positive impact, some in which it shows positive impact, and some in which it is a bit mixed. Like for example, microcredit has been something which has been talked about a lot. Yeah. And I think it's fair to say that there isn't strong evidence of it ultimately empowering women. So this is based on the studies which people like Esther Duflo and Cynthia Kinnan and Abhijit Banerjee have done. So there isn't sort of strong overall evidence that microcredit has a gender dimension, and B, that it is actually pulling people out of poverty. I think the levels of credit, and there is something structural about how microcredit is designed, because people start repaying quite quickly once they get the loan. So it's not letting them do anything ambitious in terms of graduating out of poverty. Yeah. In terms of empowering women, on non-economic dimensions, I think that, of course, this is mostly from, the most robust evidence is based on, I'm thinking about political participation and political representation. Much of this evidence is coming from India, and I think there the evidence is more on the positive side, in terms of what are the kind of public goods that are provided at the village level. In my own work, for example, with Lakshmi Iyer and Petia Topolova and Prachi Mishra, we find that reporting of crimes against women goes up substantially when there are women political leaders. So I think, and then there are sort of follow-up work by Petia Topolova and Laurie Beeman and others also shows that over time the bias against women leaders goes down, and that girls' aspirations are better. So I think that in that dimensions of empowerment, even if it may not be immediately in terms of money, you do see that political representation and having women participate in local government seems to make a difference. Especially in my work, I would say that from the lowest levels of government, so if women at the village level make a bigger difference. I guess the last thing is about sort of conditional cash transfers. There is some evidence that violence comes down against women. There is some evidence that it goes up. I think the evidence is mixed, on those dimensions. So, in terms of the work that I'm sort of currently interested in terms of the gender gap and psychological, sort of discrimination and de-biasing the people who tend to commit the discrimination, I think the jury is still out. Making people aware of their biases is not the same thing as getting rid of them.
Yeah, okay, I see. Okay, so thanks a lot for contributing to scientific disclosure with this interview. That's all.
My pleasure.